The Echo Chamber, brought to you by the Holmes Report and produced by the international broadcast specialist Marketeers. Sponsored by the Bullet Group, putting you in tomorrow's conversations today.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 200th episode of the Echo Chamber podcast. This is Arun Sudhaman, joined by Paul Holmes. How are you, Paul?
I'm very good, thank you. It's worth mentioning this month is also the 20th anniversary of the Holmes Report.
Wow.
It feels like those two things shouldn't be coincidental. Hitting 220 at the same time, but they are.
20th anniversary in 2020 and the 200th episode.
There's some synchronicity there.
There is. It's almost like we should rebrand.
Oh, okay. Let's do that.
Maybe we will. Maybe we won't. So anyway, this is the 200th episode, but it's actually not. I think we actually we've done more than 200 episodes, but we lost a few when we transitioned, to use an awful word, from one podcast provider to another.
Okay.
But officially, this is the 200th episode. And what's really interesting is that the first episode we did, as you might be aware, was an interview with
Harold Burson.
Correct. It was an interview with Harold Burson. He obviously passed away last week, Friday, at the age of 98. It's difficult, I think, to put his impact on the global PR industry into words. Many people have tried. Many people, I think, have used the occasion really to talk about the impact the impact he had on their lives. And that was really a huge kind of lesson for me. I mean, it was something we all knew, but to see how many people he had kind of touched and impacted in the industry was quite remarkable. And I think your article, your In Memoriam tribute, it's probably the best effort I've seen to really capture his impact on the industry, because it was manifold, really. There's no one way to look at it. He was, not just a great person. He was a great boss. He was a great businessman as well. Much of the kind of discussion of Harold Burson's legacy in recent years has focused on just what an amazing person he is. And part of me wonders if that's because maybe the caliber of leader in the PR industry is not the same as it was in the past. But leaving that aside, I thought it might be useful to start by asking you, I mean, what does his legacy mean to you?
Well, one story that I didn't include in the In Memoriam, because it didn't come to me when I was writing it for whatever reason, was we held our third or fourth awards dinner as a company. This was before the Holmes Report, when we were still inside PR, at the United Nations Delegates Dining Hall. And between reserving the venue and holding the dinner, there was the first bomb attack on the World Trade Center in New York. So this would have been the very early 90s. Mm-hmm. And security around New York was stepped up at every major venue. And of course, the United Nations was viewed as one. And so we arrived at the UN in the early evening to find out that several new layers of security had been put in place. And basically everything that was metal, from rings to earrings to necklaces, was setting off the new security system and required a hand wand before you could go through. And again, this was 1991, before this was sort of a routine thing at airports, before it was a routine thing, for travelers. And so guests started to arrive at about 6:30 in the evening. And at 9:30 in the evening, the line was still very, very long to get into the dinner, which was supposed to have started two hours earlier. And it was a giant, can I say clusterfuck on the podcast? I assume I can.
Well, you just
it was
did,
a giant,
so.
Yes, it was a giant clusterfuck. And Harold was already into his 70s. So his people asked us if we could move his Lifetime Achievement Award, which was supposed to be the last award of the evening, to the beginning of the evening because he was feeling tired. I thought that was perfectly reasonable. So we moved Harold's Lifetime Achievement Award to the beginning. And so he was the first person up on stage other than me. I spent about 10 minutes apologizing for how late everything had gotten. And then Harold came up on stage, and the mood in the room was, it was one of those things which could have gone either way. People were not happy. And Harold said, very dryly, he said, "I want to thank you for this Lifetime Achievement Award, but those of you in the audience will understand that when I started queuing to get in here, it was actually an award for the most promising newcomer." And there was a moment of silence, and then everybody laughed, and then the entire room was just fine because everybody figured if Harold Burson could laugh about it and make a joke about it, then it was the least they could do. And I'm not sure. I think that Harold saved our company that night, but he certainly saved our awards dinner. And again, it was, in retrospect, so absolutely typical of his good grace and his charm and his humor and his all-round decency that I should have expected. And the great thing is that whoever you meet, if you meet somebody who's known Harold for more than a couple of years, they all have a story like that. They all have a story about, how he went out of his way, how he diffused the situation, whether they're a client or a colleague or a competitor. Harold just treated everybody the same, and with that, good grace and charm, and it was sort of amazing to me. I don't want to single out any of his peers at the time. But he stood head and shoulders above many of them, not just as a professional and not just as a businessman, though both of those things were true. But in terms of just sheer decency and charm, not everybody was like that. And not everybody today is like that. Mm-hmm. And it was a great lesson to me in terms of persuading me that, nice guys didn't actually have to finish last, that you could build a tremendous business without compromising your, basic decency. And, I was very young at the time. I mean, thinking back to that, I was still in my 20s when that incident occurred. I was probably 24 or 25 when I met him. Mm-hmm. And the people I'd worked for and a lot of the people that I'd met in the business, it would have been easy to get very cynical about, what you had to be in order to be a powerful individual. And Harold was the exact opposite of all of those things. He wasn't ruthless, particularly. He wasn't rude. He wasn't an elitist of any kind. Anyway.
Yeah, no, I think it's really important. In a way, he kind of represented the best of the industry. From everything you've said, from everything many people have said. How do you view his impact on the on the industry as a businessman, because the firm he built, particularly in the way that it not just became the biggest firm in America, but the biggest firm in the world, it was pioneering. And in a way, I guess, it probably pioneered the whole idea of a global PR agency.
Yeah. I think there are a couple of things to be said about that. I mean, the first is, to a certain extent, what Harold did in the sort of 70s, and then after he got Y&R money at the end of the 70s, during the 80s, now looks like the logical way to build an international PR firm, right? Everybody who's followed in Harold's footsteps has essentially done it the same way, and we sort of think, well, yeah, that's how you do it. But I don't think it was by any means obvious how to do it when Harold was doing it, because PR is fundamentally different than, say, advertising when it comes to globalization, when it comes to internationalization. You can still see the same ad with a different voiceover or a different soundtrack in multiple markets around the world. But you can't do a PR campaign that way. PR campaigns have to be localized. They require local people with local knowledge, talking to local newspapers, talking to local employees. And so what Harold did in building and people deride the sort of hub and spoke model of public relations. They deride the dots on the map model of building out an agency. But the reality is that nobody has ever built a global PR agency any other way, right? You have to do that. And Harold figured it out. By the time I met him, he was already in the process of replacing the expat Americans who ran every office at first with local indigenous talent. Burson-Marsteller was the factory that produced PR talent in most of these markets.
No question.
It was the first place that if you were a kid from Singapore who wanted to go into public relations, or a kid from France who wanted to go into public relations, or a kid from Spain who wanted to go to public relations, that would train you up and give you the tools either to lead the Burson-Marsteller office there, or often to go off and start your own firm. And I mean, you and I, we meet people around the world who have thriving 10, 15, 20, 25, $30 million PR firms who started out at Burson-Marsteller and learned their craft at Burson-Marsteller. Yeah. And this was at a time when, training was viewed as a burden on the agency. And lots of firms did not have robust professional development programs, and Burson-Marsteller did. And it was the place you went to recruit people from because you knew they'd be well trained. But it was also the place everybody wanted to stay because they knew that they would grow and develop and learn. And again, you look back at that today and you think, well, sure, it's obvious that you should do that and invest in talent as an agency, but it wasn't obvious before Harold did it.
Yeah, indeed. Now, he sold his agency, obviously. So first he sold it to Y&R, and then I think Y&R sold to WPP. Is that correct?
Yeah. Well, Y&R, yes. He sold it to Y&R, and Y&R was bought by WPP.
Yes. Okay. And one of the things that I thought was interesting when we had him on the podcast for episode 1, which was, I think, right at the beginning of 2013, we did ask him about public ownership. Because I was curious to see if how he felt about public ownership of PR firms, and I can't remember his exact words, but he certainly wasn't a fan. Do you think that's an attitude that he'd had all along, or was this something that had kind of had developed as the years passed? I
think, and his memoir came out just a couple of years ago, and if you read the book, I think it's clear that that he recognized the trade-off that was inherent, and look, he wanted to build a global public relations firm, and he needed funding to do that. It wasn't something he was going to be able to do out of cash flow, I think. And so he accepted the trade-off. And Harold was not somebody who would sit around and badmouth anybody that he worked with.
No.
I don't think I ever heard Harold say anything beyond a sort of non-committal grunt when I demeaned somebody. That would necessarily give away how he felt about them. I mean, and he was the same way with the parent company, right? So he publicly and on the record always respected the people that he worked with, but I think he understood quite clearly, and you could pick this up in a number of different ways, that Burson-Marsteller had compromised a degree of its the word that keeps coming into my head is integrity, but I don't mean that in terms of its ethics or its morals as much as just its autonomy and its independence and its freedom to act. Right, and it was clear to me that, for example, some of the CEOs that Burson had in the later years felt as if they were imposed on the organization rather than being selected by the organization, right? And I think he saw that as problematic. But I've known enough people who have sold their agencies to big publicly traded entities to know that at least half of them, wake up 180 days of the year with some sort of regret about having done that. There are a lot of compromises involved, and Harold went in with his eyes open. But I suspect that he still wondered about what would have happened without, what Burson-Marsteller would have looked like today, without the compromises of public ownership.
So his impact, I think, on the industry, certainly in terms, if we talk about the global PR industry, it's difficult to think of anyone else who played such a huge role in its development.
Yeah, he was. I honestly, I said this. I said this to you in an email afterwards. He was. I think clearly our greatest living PR man, right? And we haven't talked about him as a PR man.
No, I was going to come to that next.
He thought deeply and broadly about our industry. If there's sort of one regret I have about Harold, is that he wasn't more of a showman, that he wasn't more forceful, that he didn't occasionally get angry about stuff in public, because what he thought about the PR industry. I mentioned in the in memoriam article the speech that he delivered to the Institute for Public Relations Education.
Yeah.
Where he talked about public relations being about advising companies how to behave, not what to say.
Yeah.
And that's something that we still see in this business. He didn't see public relations as a communications discipline. He saw public relations as a management discipline. He saw the advice that he gave to companies on how to act as being much more important as any advice he could give them on what to say. And that's critical. I remember I'm trying to remember the context of this, but a little while ago, I either wrote an article or gave a speech in which, for about the 100th time in my life, I railed against Milton Friedman and the idea that the only social responsibility of business is to make a profit for its shareholders. And 2 days later, I got an email from Catherine Sullivan at BCW with an attachment of a speech that Harold had given in like 1975 or something, where he basically made exactly the same point, except he was much more polite and much more agreeable. And, you know, I have the tendency to think that Milton Friedman is both a moron and an incredibly damaging historical figure. And Harold just engaged with him as if, look, I think you're wrong about this, and actually business has all, and he was an early thinker and pioneer about corporate social responsibility and what it meant. And Carol Cohn, her blog on Carol Cohn on Purpose, has a wonderful tribute to Harold's thinking about CSR, because he was so far ahead of the rest of us. And then you could see that as it played out in, for example, the Tylenol crisis. And the Tylenol crisis is another of those things. I've met, 20 PR people who told me that they played a sort of central role in the decision to recall Tylenol. And I know 2 or 3 of them were actually sort of there in the room. Harold never bragged about his role in that crisis at all. He was incredibly reticent about it. And yet, it's impossible for me to believe that he wasn't there in the room telling Jim Burke at J&J to do the right thing. I mean, I don't know that he necessarily needed telling, but I'm sure that Harold was a voice for the right thing in that situation, because, everything that he said about public relations was about the need to be ethical and responsible and to act with integrity.
Yeah. Why do you think it is that despite, Harold's definition of public relations as being more about behavior than communication, about being, more about reality than rhetoric, and, so many senior leaders of the industry came from Burson. Despite all of that, despite the efforts of people like yourself, we're still in a situation today where public relations is defined largely in terms of communications and so forth. Are these just the market realities that couldn't be contended with?
Clients would much rather pay you, whatever it is these days, $750 an hour to spin whatever it is they want to do, than take your advice and make substantial and expensive changes to their business. The market realities are the market realities. And I think often saying the right thing is good enough.
Yeah.
But I don't want to turn a tribute to Harold into me getting up on a hobby horse that I've been riding for 30 years without any notable progress.
You talked about, how Harold was a big advocate for ethical practice. Burson-Marsteller had clients that perhaps inhabited some of those gray areas. Did you ever see any tension between, his own personal views and the work the firm did?
Again, Harold and I often arrived at the same place in terms of our thinking by sort of different routes. I would say something that I thought was sort of this amazing revelation that I'd had about, how PR firms should operate, or what what good practice looked like or whatever. And I having sort of gone around the industry telling people how clever I was, I'd sit down with Harold and do exactly the same thing, and then Harold would pull out something from 20 years earlier where he'd been doing this, forever. And just, as I say, not yelling about it or screaming about it or telling everybody how brilliant it was. And so Harold and I think, arrived at the same place, which was that you could do good work for bad clients. One of my first interactions with Burson-Marsteller was with a guy who was running their UK operations when I got into the PR business I think he's probably running Europe, actually, when I got into the PR business in 85. And his name was Mike Horton. He later died tragically. He was stabbed to death in a hotel room in London by his secretary's husband. And Mike was in huge trouble. Well, huge trouble. When I met him, he just dealt with a reporter from Time Out. This is how long ago it was. Time Out had reporters who had been doing an expose on Burson-Marsteller's work for the military junta in Argentina, which was understandably controversial. But I sat down with Mike and we talked about it. And the work was almost entirely what I've just talked about, rather. It was advising the military junta to behave differently. It wasn't coming out to Europe and saying, actually, all of those disappearances in Argentina are either, made up or exaggerated or, a good thing because those people were all terrorists and revolutionaries. It was advising the government of Argentina to be better. And, look, there are times, I think, when everybody convinces themselves that they're doing that, and they're not doing it quite as much as they might have. And I'm sure that was true in many instances. For Burson-Marsteller, you don't always live up to the ideals. And sometimes the client flat out doesn't take your advice and you keep getting paid anyway, hoping that they will. But by and large, I think Harold understood that the clients that needed good public relations advice the most were often the clients who, when he came into contact with them, were doing things the worst. And I think, I think most clients became better as a result of his advice, certainly. And hopefully of the firm's advice too. But I think, I think I don't want to portray Harold as a saint, because I think that actually sort of doesn't really do justice to any complex human being. For example, it occurred to me, I was writing that list of all the people that was sort of dotted around the 13th floor of Burson-Marsteller when I went to visit in 1987, and looking at it, it was like it was an incredible place, because it's as if today or as if 2 years ago you had Alan Parker and Gershon Kext and Jim Abernathy and George Sard all on one floor of one agency in one city. I mean, it was such an all-star lineup, but it was an all-star lineup of white men, right? And but I started my in memoriam by saying I used to tell Harold that when I went around the world, if I went to Singapore and sat in a room with 10 PR people, I'd be able to pick out the Burson person. Within 20 minutes of conversation based on what they say. But honestly, it was also based on the fact that they would have been a white man.
Sure.
The Burson, and I think it took an inordinately long time before women at Burson were were on a par with and taken as seriously as men. And it was a very corporate, very B2B, and as a result of that, very masculine organization for much longer than it should have been. And you couldn't avoid that reality. And in fact, a lot of those people who went on to start their own agencies or to develop their careers did so elsewhere.
It's true. And increasingly so, of course. In the last 2 decades, we saw the rise of a number of other networks, that in certainly in terms of revenues, eventually overtook Burson-Marsteller. Were they all just playing from the same playbook that Harold had developed?
I think probably. So when I started writing about public relations, there were 2 firms that were clearly both the biggest and the best, and that was Burson-Marsteller and Hill and Alton. Burson-Marsteller has, I think, been more consistently at the top of the PR industry in the time that I've been writing about it, of those 2. But those were the 2. And then sometime probably in the 90s, they were overtaken in terms of their reputation by Fleischman Hillard and Ketchum. And I think if you sat down with the people who ran Fleischman Hillard, John Graham, if you sat down with the people who ran Ketchum, basically at the time Dave Drobis and Ray Kocher, they would all acknowledge a debt to Burson-Marsteller and to Harold specifically, in terms of the way in which they ran their businesses. I think in the last decade, those firms have been replaced by Edelman and Weber Shandwick as the sort of 2, not just the 2 biggest PR firms in the world, but the 2 best run. And I think that coincided with a shift in what great PR firms were about.
Interesting.
In that, I mentioned a few minutes ago, Burson-Marsteller was a corporate B2B firm. And actually, I sat down with one of Harold's successors, early in the .com boom, and he insisted that Burson would get out of the consumer business entirely. They'd leave it to Cohn & Wolfe because you couldn't make money on consumers. The only people who wanted sort of high-end strategic advice were the corporate crisis, financial communications, public affairs people. And that shifted dramatically as digital and social became a huge part of our business. And I don't think you'd find anybody, well, I think you'll find boutique firms like Brunswick and Text and APCO and, those guys, Finsbury, who are making a lot of money giving high-end strategic corporate advice. But if you want to be a big global public relations firm, you better be great at marketing. You better be great at consumer. And that's something that, Weber and Edelman figured out a long time before some of their competitors did. I think the game changed at that point. You'd had this sort of 2-dimensional matrix of we need people who are great at the practice area. They really know employee comms. They really know public affairs. They really know financial communications. And we need people who understand the energy sector and the financial sector and the healthcare sector and the technology sector. And that was fine. But then the .com revolution imposed another layer on top of that of, we need people who know graphics, or we need people who know video, and we need people who know animation, and we need people who know all those other things, and that got imposed on top. And that, I think, shifted the business model, the training and professional development model, and all of that. And that was a different level of complexity than the industry was dealing with in the 70s and 80s when Harold was defining it. And so I think, I think this generation probably has had to find new ways of managing that are perhaps a little bit different.
Indeed. Well, it was a sad day, I think, for the global industry, the global PR industry.
Yes.
The loss of Harold Burson. I think clearly we will not see his like again. I think that was in fact a point you made.
I just think
passed away.
There'll be no, he was the pioneer. He was the guy who did it first. There's only one of those, right? In the same way that there's only one Neil Armstrong. I mean, we can start sending people to the moon tomorrow, but the reality is that the first person there.
Yeah, but that whole generation of entrepreneurs, founders, Al Golan, Dan Edelman, Harold Burson. I'm sure you have other names you can throw in. I mean,
the one that's still out there is David Finn.
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, slightly smaller scale, slightly different story, but that generation of people who started building up their PR firms, in the sort of 60s and 70s and early 80s is more or less gone.
Okay, well, Paul, thank you very much for being on our 200th episode. I'll see you on
Always a pleasure.
I'll see you perhaps on the 300th, maybe. Let's see. Maybe we'll get you back before then.
I don't know. You start to think about your own mortality.
Oh no! Come on, come on. You still got a long way to go, and indeed a lot of work to do, which I'll talk to you.
When I first met Harold, so I must have been 23 because it was 1985. I must have been 23 when I met Harold. I must have been the most obnoxious kid he'd met in forever. I'm sure he couldn't believe that he had to deal with somebody like me. But at that time, I was utterly convinced that I wasn't going to live to be 40. So I'm already years ahead of where I thought I'd be.
Yeah, you're playing with house money now, Paul.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for listening. We'll be back soon.
You've been listening to The Echo Chamber. Brought to you by the Holmes Report and produced by Marketeers. Sponsored by the Bullet Group, putting you in tomorrow's conversations today.